Thank you. It's a great privilege to be able to speak here and to have the final session to wrap up a fabulous 2 days. And I'm hoping to take you to a few places that you haven't visited in the past 36 hours of insightful exploration of Ruskin and his influence. Let me start in a place I visited when, perhaps the first place and the most unlikely place that I visited when researching my book, Ruskinland. This is Tampa Bay, Florida, an in-between community called Ruskin that was founded in 1908 by the mustachioed gentlemen alongside John Ruskin on this mural. The image was designed by the local artist Mike Parker and painted on the side of a disused furniture market with the help of 20 volunteers to celebrate the centenary of Ruskin's founding in 2008. It was third time lucky for Ruskin's founders. They ended up here, a boat ride from the city of Tampa, after failed attempts to set up Ruskinite communities in Missouri and Illinois. And in Ruskin, Florida, on the banks of the Little Manatee River, their ideas and Ruskin's took root among scrub palms, cockroaches, and rattlesnakes. They established a cooperative common good society and a new free Ruskin College with a tenuous link to Ruskin College, Oxford, which had an eclectic curriculum that aimed to achieve a happy combination of head, heart, and hand, the triad of intellectual, moral, and vocational education that Ruskin himself had advocated in Manchester 50 years earlier. And so there is Ruskin today. The college and the Common Good Society aren't there anymore, but some of the original houses of the founder's family still stand, including this one, which is incongruously modelled on a picture of a Swiss chalet that Ruskin wrote about in The Poetry of Architecture. And it's there amid the mansions and the manatees and the fast expanding new housing developments along the coast. Thanks to the original Ruskinites' vision, John Ruskin is probably the only great Victorian intellectual to have a drive-in movie theatre named after him. But there are more important links between Ruskin and his ideas and the world today, and a network of enduring influence that, with apologies to the Ruskinland near Bewdley, I have called Ruskinland. Let me explain this in a bit more detail through my own experience. So, as a teenager, I studied a little bit of history of art. I knew about Ruskin's role as artist and art critic, and when I revisited Venice last year for the first time in a while, I found the places and works of art that had astonished and energized Ruskin in the 19th century, the Tintorettos, the Carpaccios, and so on, the Ducal Palace, had been on my itinerary in the second half of the 20th, when I first visited his Paradise of Cities, age 16, with a school art trip. And then again as a regular traveller in the Lake District with a family home not far from Brantwood, I knew about Ruskin's love of the region, but it wasn't until I visited Brantwood in 2009, in the middle of the financial crisis, and picked up a copy of Unto This Last, his raging polemic against orthodox economics, that I started to add some of the other pieces of the Ruskin patchwork. And I found in these essays, laying into the smug captains of Victorian capitalism, lots of parallels with our contemporary concerns then and still now about inequality, about the social uselessness of some forms of finance, about the excesses of executive pay, about the way in which chief executives had abandoned their position as what Ruskin would have called honest merchants, and about the uses of wealth and the production of its toxic opposite, ilth. And as I explored Ruskinland through first a column in the Financial Times and then later as I researched the book, I started to notice the contours of other important areas where I think Ruskin shapes, or should shape, our world today. Seeing and understanding, reflection, provenance, humans in their environment, thoughtful planning and building, ethical leadership and meaningful work, and connectedness. Ruskin's great lesson to his successors was the vital importance of learning to see clearly to understand the world around us, which, as we've heard, he used to say, such understanding could be achieved mainly in his case through drawing. Now, though his aphorisms, including some that Ruskin never said but sound Ruskinian, continue to circulate on Twitter and other social media, I think it's a bit of a stretch to imagine him cramming his thoughts into 280-character tweet. But who would not want to follow the 19th century's greatest eye on Instagram? But the mark on paper was not the point for Ruskin. He wanted people to exercise and refine their powers of observation in a way that fits precisely with today's quest to improve visual literacy. And this approach also, I would argue, offers important lessons to our public figures, our policymakers and opinion formers so prone to instant, unthinking reaction to events as they struggle to understand the changing world around them. In the same way, Ruskin wanted us to devote time to seeing and thinking. So his way of travel by horse-drawn carriage at an average of 7 miles an hour looks a bit old-fashioned to us. He was, of course, wealthy enough, thanks to his father's patronage and commercial success, to be able to take his time. But his leisurely approach chimes with the counsel of monks, mindfulness experts and other advocates of slow food, slow travel and slow living in our fast-moving world, to live in the moment. Provenance. Ruskin believed strongly that buildings, work and craft should be rooted in the landscape and communities around them. He urged young artists to start by being true to nature and artisans to use local materials. And as the consequences of globalization become clearer, it's important to see this not as a prescription to move backwards or stay stuck in the past, a tendency he was, I think, guilty of overemphasizing, but as a more productive, happier and better balanced way of advancing. Humans in their environment. I think it's too tempting to think of Ruskin as an unbending defender of the status quo or a grumpy crusader for neo-feudalism, cottage life and unattainable rural idyls. He seems to me someone rather who's thought deeply about how to encourage the fruitful coexistence of people and the places where they lived and worked. And of course, as we've heard and know, he loved the wild open spaces such as the Lakeland Fells, but he also understood profoundly how people related to them, speaking out about industrial pollution and what we'd now call climate change before the term was even known. And as Alistair was explaining, he hated the overbuilt industrial cities, those hellish melting pots of the mid to late 19th century, but he also supported ways to make communities more bearable and more habitable, bringing us indirectly to the Garden Cities movement and its drive for thoughtful planning and building. He fought to conserve the buildings and landscapes, not to restore them in new and inauthentic ways, and to preserve this balance of creative architecture, nature, and public amenities. And he outlined for the first time through the study of his beloved Venice, among other places, that buildings and cities can have that moral quality expressed through their art and architecture. He would, of course, have been involved in talking to us about the tragedy of Notre Dame and the opportunity of the restoration, because he spoke about Notre Dame in 1871 when it was being bombarded as absolutely unreplaceable as a pure and lovely source of art instruction by any future energy or ingenuity. And there are lessons here, I think, for planners, architects and builders as they strike a balance between pressure to house growing urban populations and to preserve green spaces. I want to dwell a little bit longer on ethical leadership and meaningful work. Ruskin was rightly criticised in his day for not always being able or even willing to put into practice some of his wild-sounding ideas, and he relied on disciples and delegates and the occasional long-suffering employee to do so. So it's hard then to see why any chief executive, team leader, or member of staff should listen to a man who barely did a stroke of conventional paid work in his life. But as I've already hinted, 21st century Ruskinland is more than ever in need of his principles of ethical leadership, even if, as I shall explain, the great machine of capitalism that he excoriated is belatedly paying attention to some of the things he flagged as fundamental 150 years ago. After I wrote about Ruskin in 2009 in the FT, a chief executive contacted me to ask, what are the 10 things the Ruskin CEO should do? Well, I came up with 5 rules for the modern merchant. First of all, provide for the nation. It's virtually the only explicit duty that Ruskin lays out for a merchant in Unto This Last. It leads naturally to his assertion that it's no more the merchant's function to get profit for himself out of that provision than it is a clergyman's function to get his stipend. And if more corporate leaders started from that sort of principle when considering their pay structures, fewer would be tempted, I think, to fall back on the old excuse that their own compensation merely reflects the market rate for their work. Second rule, be honest. In his 1862 introduction to Unto This Last, Ruskin underlines that honesty is not a disturbing force which deranges the orbits of the economy, but a consistent and commanding force, by obedience to which, and by no other obedience, those orbits can continue clear of chaos. Ruskin's talking about honesty, obviously, not only in the sense of moral behaviour. He insisted that merchant leaders should provide and produce goods of perfectness and purity. And that is, as always with Ruskin, a very high standard. But the financial chaos of the financial crisis was triggered in part when the sale of inappropriate mortgage products to poor borrowers backfired, and when loans that banks had repackaged into overcomplicated investments imploded. And to Ruskin, that crisis would have looked like an inevitable consequence of banks consenting to the adulteration of what they were producing. The third lesson for CEOs from Ruskin: lead. The responsibility of wise leaders to lead wisely was central to Ruskin's thinking. And his definition of wealth, which we've heard a number of times in the last 2 days, is the possession of the valuable by the valiant. And his definition of a rich man is therefore the one who has the widest helpful influence, both personal and by means of his possessions, over the lives of others. A fourth lesson: collaborate. Ruskin talks of cooperation as a law of life, the polar opposite to competition, which he calls, along with anarchy, a law of death. He didn't necessarily mean to attack competition in the strict market sense. He abhorred, I think, rather the notion of a struggle for survival between individuals. But the fact that history has since proved that competition, fair competition, is a better alternative to monopoly doesn't invalidate Ruskin's endorsement of cooperation. And modern business depends on constructive collaboration between management and workforce, between customer and supplier, even between competitors through, for example, joint ventures in new markets or territories, and obviously between companies and customers. When I wrote an introduction for the edition of Unto This Last that I showed on the slide earlier, I think I understated the importance of this last law, of this fourth law. Margaret Heffernan, the author, has since written an extremely compelling critique of a world based on competition called A Bigger Prize, in which she details the ill effects of competition in areas as diverse as business, sports, and academia. And she writes in that book that little in our culture trains, rewards, or even seems to notice great collaboration. And the final rule: create wealth, which doesn't sound so different from the traditional corporate imperative to add to shareholder value. But Ruskin takes this much further by introducing the concept of ILF. Google trades on the basis of a philosophy that you can make money without doing evil. So it's a rare example of a company that initially set out to avoid creating ILF, though it's struggled as concerns have grown about data privacy to avoid ILF seeping into even its model. Other companies, such as Unilever, Danone of France and Natura, the Brazilian cosmetics company that owns Body Shop, now work to grow their businesses to the mutual benefit of both the company and other stakeholders. A trade-off that coincidentally I've analysed in a new FT series that launches on Monday called The Company of the Future. Some companies have gone further even than that, reconstituting themselves as benefit corporations, which in some US states is a way that businesses can give priority to serving, say, the interests of the local community, or in the case of Patagonia, the big manufacturer of outerwear, the environment ahead of the interests of their owners. And as for shareholder value, there's movement here too. In August, the Business Roundtable, which is the influential US business group incorporating companies such as Amazon, JP Morgan Chase and others, amended its two-decade-old declaration that corporations exist principally to serve their shareholders. While each of our individual companies serves its own corporate purpose, the Roundtable said, we share a fundamental commitment to all of our stakeholders, customers, employees, suppliers, communities, and last in the list, shareholders. Even my own employer, the Financial Times, has this week declared a new agenda for capitalism, encouraging companies to combine profit with purpose. Ruskin was a great standard bearer for purpose, meaning, and happiness in work, which he saw shining through the creative impulses of the anonymous builders and decorators of the great Gothic cathedrals. In my day job at the FT, I see this concern about meaning at work blossoming into a movement. Dan Pink, the management writer, has described the prerequisites for self-motivation at work as autonomy, mastery, and purpose. But John Ruskin got there first, when he wrote in 1851 that for people to be happy at work, they must be fit for it, they must not do too much of it, and they must have a sense of success in it. As I've said, whenever I've talked about my book, that sense of success is particularly good because I don't feel that we declare victory at the end of every day at work. We edge gradually towards some sense of success in whatever we're working on. Other companies are explicitly or implicitly acting on some of these principles. So the bathroom fittings company Kohler, whose founders constructed the company round Ruskin's aphorism, life without industry is guilt, and industry without art is brutality, is still going with those words on the walls of its headquarters. The Italian fashion designer Cucinelli, its founder has built a community based on the importance of beauty, craft, and a fair wage, and instilling some of the Ruskinian ideals. And here in London, the East End furniture workshop Unto This Last is shaped by Ruskinian ideals and finds ways to make work interesting for its staff and operates on the principle that local is logical, a principle that it hopes to expand into a network of urban workshops. To conclude, let me talk about connectedness, something that Jorge touched on and Alistair. Ruskin was the central weaver of this web of extraordinarily diverse interests, which this symposium has touched on. He saw, if not always clearly, how art, science, nature, history, the environment, politics, economics, and industry sprang from and relied on each other. And we'd now describe this linkage, as Robert Hewison mentioned before the break, using words such as interdisciplinary, interconnection, interdependence, even the internet itself. Ruskin's one-man World Wide Web had plenty of gaps and patches and oddities. So does ours, of course. But in it, he cultivated myriad hyperlinks to new areas of enlightenment and exploration. He was, in other words, a genius at what the sort of modish management strategists that I talked to during the day at the FT now sometimes call joining the dots. He was also aware that if we didn't carefully cultivate the links between the dots, then the whole web could collapse. And that insight was obvious in his prophetic concern about air pollution and destruction of the natural world, and in his pragmatic focus on the education of workers ground down by industrialization. In his excellent book, After Ruskin, Stuart Eagles warns against the temptation in searching for Ruskin's influence of finding the shadow of your subject lurking in every doorway. And I plead guilty to this charge. I'm also certainly prone to the journalistic sin of expressing Ruskin's importance in terms of influence and relevance, a trend to which Francis O'Gorman objects in the introduction to the Cambridge Companion to John Ruskin. But finding modern parallels with the predictions of dead prophets can do no harm. As Ruth Nutter of the Ruskin in Sheffield programme pointed out to me recently, a connection with the past may even help people realise that they're not alone as they explore radical solutions to important contemporary problems. Young people in Sheffield, for example, she said, are particularly inspired by the concept of the ideal society outlined by Ruskin as they search for ways to reconceive and reshape the turbulent and uncertain world they live in and that we all live in. As we know, Ruskin urged people to expunge the word utopian from their dictionary. Things are either possible or impossible. If the thing is impossible, you need not trouble yourselves about it. If possible, try for it. Of course, and I think others have touched on this, anyone who tries to swallow Ruskin's prescriptions for the world whole will probably die of indigestion. And even he recognised that. I like the story of the devoted British follower of John Ruskin who was so animated by his diatribes against the railways that he refused to use the postal service in case his letters found their way onto a landscape despoiling steam train. Instead, Cook and Wedderburn recount in the library edition, this man spent a large part of his life tramping about the country delivering letters in person. But when he finally met Ruskin, the great man told him off, pointing out that he personally preferred to abuse railways, but meanwhile to use them. And the chastened and presumably footsore disciple recalled, "It was grievous to discover that the master himself was no true Ruskinian." In the unlikely location of Ruskin, Florida, I was constantly struck by reminders of Ruskin's ideas. And whether they trace their lineage back to Ruskin himself or not, or whether even that lineage could be traced, seems to me less important than that they are there. So there's a thriving local artist community dedicated to seeing more clearly. There's a cultural centre offering different perspectives on different parts of culture to residents from a repurposed fire station with shades of the Walkley Museum, and with ambitions to expand to link the local library and form a cultural campus. There's the volunteer spirit that drove the creation of the mural, which reminded me of the Hinksey road building project and its incredible network of amateur builders who went on to do so much in social welfare, political reform and other fields. And there is what was described to me by one resident as a deep-rooted appreciation of the value of work. There's also poverty and uncertainty among the poorer residents and among the migrant workers who travel there from Mexico to pick fruit and vegetables, the kinds of people who Ruskin, if he were there today, would surely have championed. And there is Ilth among the McMansions and property developers. It's just one place that illustrates that the challenges Ruskin addressed keep recurring. And as they do, it seems to me essential to bring to the surface today the sorts of solutions he proposed, and to explore and cultivate the deep connections that link Ruskinland, from Venice's Grand Canal to Florida's Little Manatee River. It doesn't matter that people pick their Ruskin from the many sometimes contradictory models available. As each generation comes to Ruskin afresh, selecting those parts of his output that seem most appropriate to fuel or guide their own projects or ideas, it becomes ever clearer that the work he began is never-ending and endlessly relevant. As Ruskin wrote as he wrapped up the 5th volume of Modern Painters in 1860, looking back over what I have written, I find that I have only now the power of ending this work, it being time that it should end, but not of concluding it, for it has led me into fields of infinite inquiry. Thank you very much.